Buenos días. Buenos días. Antes de presentar al invitado del día de hoy, les recordamos que hay dos salidas de emergencia. ¿No se escucha? Uno al lado izquierdo y otro lado derecho. Recuerdan apagar sus celulares, ponlos en modo silencio. Y bueno, bienvenidos a este seminario extraordinario del Instituto de Biología. Hoy nuestro ponente es el Dr. Wayne Madison. El Dr. Madison realizó su licenciatura en la Universidad de Toronto y su doctorado en la Universidad de Harvard. Posteriormente, un postdoc en la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Y entre 1990 y 2003 fue profesor asociado y profesor asistente de la Universidad de Arizona, y durante una parte de ese tiempo tuvo el puesto de David Lucille Packard Fellow for Science and Engineering. De 2008 a 2013 fue director del Beatty Museo de Biodiversidad en Vancouver, de Columbia Británica. Y actualmente es en el Departamento de Zoología y Botánica de la Universidad de Columbia Británica. Dr. Madison es profesor y cátedra de investigación de Canadá en la Facultad de Ciencia del Centro de Investigación de Biodiversidad de la Universidad de Columbia Británica. Y es fellow de la Sociedad Royal de Canadá. Sus líneas de investigación incluyen la sistemática y diversidad de las arañas saltarinas y la teoría de la sistemática y la programación computacional. Nos da mucho gusto recibir de nuevo a Wayne. Ha pasado mucho tiempo desde su última visita. El título de su plática de hoy es ¿Qué es una especie? Un diálogo entre la teoría y la naturaleza. Damos la bienvenida al Dr. Madison.
¿Se puede usar este por si acaso? Sí. Por si acaso, ok. Empiezo a caminar mucho. Muchas gracias, David, para la introducción linda. Gracias a todo el mundo venir. Estoy tan feliz de ver mis amigos antiguos y amigos nuevos. Siempre es bueno venir aquí. Para mí, el Instituto de Biología, para mí es es parte de mi hogar, más o menos. Tal vez va a estar claro después de esta charla, porque muchos de los asuntos de esta charla son asuntos en que mucha gente aquí piensa. Ok. Oh, right. Ok. Entonces, antes de empezar la charla propia, voy a empezar con un cuento de cómo yo llegué a esta contemplación de las especies. Es porque conecta con temas al final de la charla. Ok. Soy dos biólogos. No está encendido. Sí, porque no veo nada rojo. Ok, gracias por avanzar los primeros. Ok, soy dos biólogos. Wayne número 1 es un aracnólogo. Soy un aracnólogo y a mí me encanta explorar la diversidad de las saltarinas, sus formas y colores. Aquí a la izquierda es yo en 1977 en que encontré esto macho. Voy a intentar con este, ojalá. Que fue de una especie nueva que todavía no he descrito, pero vamos a ver, ojalá. Y a la izquierda y a la derecha en este año. Y como los aracnólogos de los siglos XIX y XX, miro bajo el microscopio y hago dibujos. Wayne número 1, una especie de araña existe por su cuenta y merece reconocimiento. Este Wayne no se preocupa tanto de los detalles teóricos o filosóficos de que son especies. Y la razón es porque muchas especies nuevas que encontramos son tan obviamente nuevas. que describirlas es una contribución de todas maneras. Güey número 2 es un teórico de filogenia y me encanta explorar las formas de ideas, su lógica y crear programas para analizar datos. ¿Qué piensa Wayne número 2 de especies? Y no ha dicho mucho este Wayne de publicaciones, ¿no? Pero en 1997 escribí un artículo sobre árboles de genes dentro de árboles de especies. Y pregunté, mientras muchas otras cosas, ¿qué es la filogenia? Es como un árbol nublado, considerando la discordia entre genes. En este punto podía haber seguido con una otra pregunta. ¿Qué es cada rama del árbol filogenético? Que es decir, que es una especie. Pero no pregunté esta pregunta en este momento, hace muchos años más tarde. Hasta empecé una colaboración con Jeanette Witten hace 7 años casi. Y este es el asunto de que voy a hablar hoy día. Una perspectiva nueva sobre los conceptos de especies. Y todas estas ideas están en un artículo que está en prensa. Esperamos que va a salir en unas pocas semanas. Entonces, en este punto, y discúlpenme, voy a cambiar en inglés, porque yo trataba practicar en español y encontré que estaba tropezando en palabras tanto que iba a estar un sufrimiento enorme dar esta parte de la charla en español. Y di cuenta el impuesto que todo el mundo en las ciencias pagan si su lengua madre no es inglés. También di cuenta del privilegio que yo tengo de haber crecido en inglés, ¿no? Pero de todos modos, la justicia tal vez dice que yo debo dar en español, pero creo que sufrimos todo en este cuarto, un poquito menos, si doy en inglés. Okay. So the first 2 sentences of our article are these. The word species, ubiquitous in the biodiversity sciences, continues to have an unsettled meaning. Does it refer to a living evolutionary unit, a unit of phylogenetic history, an ecological unit, or merely a collection of similar organisms? And so there is an enormous literature going especially back to the 1940s, but even further than that, discussing what is a species from both philosophical and biological perspectives. And so there are many named concepts. A lot of them have little acronyms and so forth. And when we started this work, Jeanette and I, we believed we were not going to add a new concept. And we believed we were not going to add a new acronym, but things changed. Perhaps the best known, and in many ways, by many people, the best accepted concept is the biological species concept of Dobzhansky and Meyer from the mid-century of last century. And it says that 2 populations are different species if they cannot interbreed, if they cannot reproduce with one another. And so I'm going to show you a little cartoon here, and these are going to be little creatures. This is its body, the phenotype, and so it represents all sorts of things, what it looks like, how it behaves, and so forth. And the other part, this little connector represents whether it can reproduce with something else, the interbreeding connectivity. Okay? And so here we have 2 populations. They are different in much of their phenotypes, but they have the same connectors. And so even if they're different in many ways, as long as they still have interbreeding compatibility, they are the same species. The BSC says, though, that even if they were identical in everything, but perhaps one molecule that makes them unable to breed, so if they have not different connectors, they are unable to breed, then they would be different species. So in the BSC, species boundary depend on the current intrinsic ability to interbreed. And what I mean by intrinsic here is that what it depends on is only their own properties. If they are separated geographically and they cannot breed because of that, they're still the same species, okay? So you do not count whether they're separated geographically. So what counts is only their intrinsic qualities. This is the first problem with the BSC. In reality, if we think about how cause works in nature, lineages are divided more than by their intrinsic properties. They're divided by extrinsic factors as well, including pure geography. And they are isolated, they diverge, even if they do not achieve intrinsic reproductive isolation. There are studies, for instance, by Roboski, that show that there is a disconnect between the evolution of reproductive isolation and the branching on phylogeny. And so when we look at a phylogeny, do we expect every branch point to represent the acquisition of reproductive isolation? And the fact is, no, it doesn't. And so a lot of interesting diverging evolution happens that doesn't directly depend upon this. Okay? So a BSC is a set of organisms sharing a property. It is not necessarily a cohesive entity in nature as it behaves. It is not an actor, a causal actor in evolution. So to reflect the real actors in evolution as they are fully formed, a species concept must include all the factors that shape those lineages. It must include reproductive isolation, it's intrinsic, but also extrinsic things like geographic context, and also things beyond reproduction, including adaptive commitments, the placement of a species into an adaptive zone, the ecological selection that not only changes its characters, but keeps it in that habitat. That forms not only a sort of isolation, but it also forms the identity of the species. And we wrote in our paper, excluding extrinsic factors from a species concept and pinning identity and boundary to only one set of intrinsic factors, regardless of whether those factors are ever put into action, treads perilously close to the very essentialism that Meyer fought. And that's ironic if you know the history of the field. So these factors, the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that mold, that shape a species lineage, we will call cohesive processes. Okay, it's just sort of a very general, vague term. And it includes the things I said. Oops. So, there's something you can't see here, but I'll explain it. We like to draw it like this. And so what you can see is that there's a very faint gray nexus of lines here that's the genealogy, sort of a tangled net of genealogy. And the arrows are these cohesive factors that the cohesive processes that are molding that lineage. And they include reproductive, ecological, and geographic factors. And so they shape not only its isolation, but it's also its identity. Now I want to focus on this next word, current. The BSC focuses on the properties of organisms and populations at this instant of time. Now you could say there are other versions and so forth, but I'm focusing right now on the canonical version of the BSC. Okay? This is the second problem. The characteristics of living organisms were shaped by processes of the past. The past explains the present explains the future. The problem is that the BSC focuses on contemporaneous factors. If the species that we want to recognize are to help us explain and understand and organize the organisms, biodiversity that we see alive today, our species must be based on the processes of the past, not of the present. So I want to build a visualization for you. And this is an aerial view of some bit of diversity. 5 populations. The blue and the green represent intrinsic reproductive isolation that we're not going to talk about now, but it's part of the figure from which this came. And so these are on the landscape. So this is a geographical view. We're now going to change it to a view in time. Okay. So we're going to sort of look to the side. And now we're going to look in our current slice of time. Okay, so this is the present. This is the future. That's the past. Today, I won't talk about the future. We do talk about the future in our talk. I'm going to talk about the past. And so the BSC focuses on the properties and populations at don't think these were designed for human fingers. So it focuses on the properties at this moment. But a species concept based on contemporaneous properties can't explain living organisms. Now, if you believe in uniformitarianism and you're saying, oh, well, the contemporaneous processes are probably a good indication of recent past, there's a whole discussion about that I don't have time to give. And there are two issues. One is things change, but the other is we tend to look more, we have more access to accidents in explanation of history than we do in contemplating the present and the future. So anyways, so it can't explain the properties of living organisms well, but a species concept on the past can. Okay, so this is the orientation we need to take. So this is not a good general purpose species concept. This is a good general purpose species concept because this past explains this present. So this is how we phrase it. A species must be a reproductive community emerging from the past into the present. So it combines aspects of the biological and phylogenetic species concept. And I'll talk a little bit about that again. But I want to say that when we started thinking about this, we wanted to try to give ideas as to how you think about this, because evolution is difficult to think about. We see our current time slice. Everything about this past is something that's inference and difficult, right? We don't see it every day. So we tried to come up with some metaphors, and here's one. Perhaps it will help. A living species is like a train you see as you arrive onto the platform. Large, intricate, still hissing, smelling faintly of hot oil, its passengers exiting in mid-conversation. You see it in front of you at this moment, but you know that it has just arrived. You sense the traces of its recent past, and that past is deeply part of what that train means to you. So now, I've said this, that the reason that we need to look into the past and also to have a comprehensive view of cause is to explain and understand and organize organisms alive today. But I really haven't explained what I mean by this, right? I've sort of left this vague. So I want to talk about this in terms of how biologists use species. And here are 4 ways. We use it to organize, this is the first one is basically taxonomy, an organizing system for storing data, as elemental units of phylogeny, as countable units for studies of diversification, and as units in conservation biology to be conservable, right? I'm not going to talk about 3 and 4. We touch on those in the paper. So the first, an organization system for storing data. So somebody goes out and they catches a fly and they study its cytogenetics and they see that it has 4 chromosome pairs. They identify it as Drosophila melanogaster, and they publish a paper saying Drosophila melanogaster has 4 chromosome pairs. They go study some behavior of some fly, and they see a courtship dance, and they publish a paper saying, and they identify it as Drosophila melanogaster, and so forth. So these different observations were made on different flies that they called in Drosophila melanogaster, and they published papers on it. Now, these observations came from different specimens, probably, most cases, right? But because they're all placed in Drosophila melanogaster, they're synthesized into a single picture of the species. Later, when we find another specimen that we identify as Drosophila melanogaster, we can infer that it has 4 chromosome pairs, 2 power wings, and so on, without even looking. And in fact, we critically depend upon this process. In fact, this is basically the basic storage and information system of all of biology, not just evolutionary, but all of biology, right? If we couldn't do this, every observation would just be floating in space all by itself. So a taxonomic species is a container for data synthesis. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, but you don't have to get it to the exact species, right? There's sort of this halo of what it informs you about. And yes, there is a nested hierarchical sense to this. It is phylogenetic, and we can talk about that. But the closer you get to placing it precisely, the more precise will be the predictions and inferences you can make. So a taxonomic species predicts and allows us to assume what characteristics the next specimen will have. And that thing that we're going to try to deal with on our table or in agriculture or whatever will have predictable properties. So to serve this function, what properties do species need to have? Which is to say, what promises does our claim that something is a species what does that need to promise? What promises need to be made? So, okay, so for the species to succeed in this, there has to be a correlation in similarities. It's sort of as simple as that. Similarities in traits that identify Drosophila melanogaster must imply similarity in other traits as well. So similarities in different genes across the genomes must be correlated, okay? Which is fine. So that might make you think, okay, maybe we can use a really simple species concept. It's nothing more than a multivariate statistical model, right? Maybe that's good enough. So here's a simple species concept. A species is a set of organisms that form a cluster in a multidimensional space of characteristics. And there are examples in the literature of this. The morphological species concept is a version of this. There are new fancy ones like Mallett's genotypic cluster species concept and so forth. But basically, this is very operational. It's done in an operationalist sense. It refers only to the traits, only to the characteristics and their correlations. It makes no claim about reproductive isolation, monophyly, or anything. So the whole idea of thinking about processes, it's not there, right? So I'm going to focus on this now because this is a problem. The fact that it makes no claims. And the reason is, in sexual organisms, so I'm going to be talking, I should just warn you, for those of you that study other things, I'm going to be talking almost entirely about the sexual organism perspective in this talk, okay? And it's got partly to do with things get so easy in asexuals that it's not that much to talk about. And you might think, oh, well, but anyways, you'll see. So, okay. So in sexual organisms, different genes can have different histories. For species to imply correlations among unstudied traits, it must have had cohesive processes binding together the histories of different loci. And if we don't assume such processes, we cannot guarantee any predictivity of traits and genes. Now you might think, well, really, we don't need to assume any specific process, but we have to assume they're there, okay? Fundamentally, an operationalist species concept is powerless. There's an expression in English, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You can't have power without assumptions. There you go. So to serve as a container for data synthesis, a species must have had cohesive processes. It must have been effectively, in asexual things, a reproductive community. The taxonomic species must at least approximate a unit with evolutionary integrity, whether cohesive processes are evoked explicitly in the concept, in its justification, or in its inference, they must be assumed. Okay, what about elemental units of phylogeny? Here you might think, oh, we don't need processes here. Or maybe just monophyly somehow is close enough to a process. So what we do is that we go out and we survey diversity. We find the smallest monophyletic units we can find. We build a phylogenetic tree. And this then is what we can use for lots of things, including we can take samples from these units. We can observe them. That then allows us to model character evolution. We can model diversification and so forth, right? So this does what we need. So for this purpose, it is sufficient that a species concept claim its units are monophyletic. So consider this then, thinking about that, what are the species concepts that claim monophyly, that sort of focus on monophyly? There is, there's the Craycraft, Mischler's, all sorts of people's PSC, but phylogenetic species concept, not the character-based one, not the Nixon and Wheeler one, but the one that actually makes a claim about monophyly. But then there's also the genealogical ones like Baum and Shaw's. So this refers only to the history of genes, nothing else. It's completely barren of any fancy process except that simple process of descent. It makes no claim about cohesive processes that shape that history. So this is a problem. And the problem is this. Our units, even if you could say, oh yeah, the claim is sufficiently strong, the estimation of them depends upon process. Our units are estimated from only a fraction of the genome and a fraction of the organisms about which we want to speak. And even if we have whole genome sequencing, we're not going to get all the organisms, individuals, about which we want to speak. To claim monophyly for all genes and all specimens, a concept must assume cohesive processes binding the loci to have at least partially shared history. Okay? So to serve as an elemental unit for phylogenetics, a species must have also had cohesive processes. It must have been a reproductive community. Phylogenetics needs its basic units to go beyond bare genealogical history and to include mechanisms of cohesion. We have no choice but to accept process theories if our units are to have power. So whether for taxonomic data synthesis, which is basically almost all biological use, or for phylogenetics, a species must embody cohesive processes. It must be a reproductive community, but not the BSC. So like, I can imagine if I had structured this talk differently and I hadn't introduced what the problems with the BSC, some of you were thinking, oh, he's just about to say the BSC, but it's not. And of course, these are because of the two problems. It must include all cohesive processes, intrinsic and extrinsic, and it must be retrospective. So I'm putting a little star there just to say, some of you might be thinking, oh my God, do I have to suddenly start learning about details of population genetics and stuff like this and theories of etc. The processes do not need to be specified. It has to be assumed that there are such processes. The more you know about them, the better, but they don't formally need to be specified. Okay? Entonces, sea para síntesis taxonómica o para la sistemática filogenética en especie, debe incorporar procesos cohesivos. Debe haber sido una comunidad reproductiva, pero no el BSC de Meyer. En cambio, una especie debe incluir todos los procesos cohesivos, intrínsecos y extrínsecos, y ser respectivo. Una especie debe ser una comunidad reproductiva emergiendo del pasado al presente. Es nuevo nuestro concepto. Let's see. Oh, that's interesting. Boy, emojis don't come across operating systems well. See, here it is. The light bulb's off. This is terrible. The light bulb's supposed to be on. So we call it the retrospective reproductive community concept. The retrospective modifies concept, not English is a little more ambiguous in this regard. This is what we call it. It could also be abbreviated as R2C2. So this is it in Spanish. So how is it different from some of the other concepts that are well known? Okay, how is it different from the biological, phylogenetic, and evolutionary species concepts? So from the biological species concept, you can derive it more or less by including all cohesive factors and by turning it retrospective. From the phylogenetic species concept, which initially as this paper was being developed, I thought of this as basically just a little tiny adjustment on the phylogenetic species concept, but I think it's good to give credit to everybody in this. You basically need to add process, the cohesive process, and not just as a ranking criterion, which is probably where Mischler would go, but as a grouping criterion as well, as a grouping sense of the grouping. From the evolutionary species concept, and likewise, it's quite close to this, you basically just have to clarify the time frame and look retrospectively. But arguably, it isn't really new. It's not one of these, but arguably, it is the tubes of multi-species coalescent models. Fundamentally, that's what this is. Now, it's because they indicate the bounds of reproductive communities of the past. Now, it turns out that the current models aren't really RRCC units, okay? Because they're too simple. The tubes in the current models are pure process. They're models as if these constraints on genealogy existed prior to and constrained the genealogy as if the genes were simply mere passengers inside these pipes, right? But in fact, that's not the way it worked because there's a feedback system going on here. And that's why these little arrows are curved like this, because every generation, those cohesive processes determine what genes survive. What genes survive then partly determine the cohesive processes of the next generation. And so it's a constant feedback process between process, genes, phenotypes, and so forth. And a species is all of these. It's not genes, it's not process, it's not phenotype, it's all of them in this feedback system. The other reason that it's not arguably new is that the practice of morphological taxonomists has long been mostly consistent with the inference of reproductive communities of the past. I wouldn't call it the morphological species concept, I mean it the way I say it, right? So now, as having been for much of my life a morphological taxonomist, I grew up under the shadow of the BSC, right? According to the BSC, we were doing it wrong. We were gathering the wrong data because interbreeding ability, the ability to reproduce with one another, is what should have been studied, not dead bodies, because I only got dead bodies, right? So that's what, it's like, well, we'll do the best we can, okay? According to the retrospective concept, however, morphological taxonomy gathers good data. I do want to emphasize that nowadays, I don't believe it's as good. It's not as good in some ways for certain things as the genomic data, right? The genomic data gives you statistical abilities that you can't have with morphology, but there's a really critical role that's going to last for a long time of morphological stuff, not only to expand to many more specimens than you can hope to touch genomically, but also to learn morphology as you go, to have an idea about what these specimens do, where they live, and so forth, but also to be the first pass before you start thinking about the genomic stuff. So anyways, but fundamentally, in principle, morphological taxonomy gathers good data. It can indicate past isolation. That's the difference. It can't indicate current isolation well, but it can indicate past isolation. BSC units are difficult to discover because reproductive isolation of the current moment has yet to leave a footprint. However, isolation of the past gave distinction to the entire genome, including morphological traits. And so morphological taxonomists using good practices, looking for multiple traits, can hear the echoes of past isolation and approximate RRCC units. BSC units leave less of a visible footprint in the present day. And so there's actually a correlation between their ease and their lack of utility, or their ease and their utility. So in this case, they're hard, but that also means that they're less useful because they explain and predict less of the world in front of us. So morphological taxonomists may have once wished to resolve BSC species, but what they've been resolving are actually the more useful units. The empirical inaccessibility of the BSC is not just a nuisance for taxonomists. It reveals the limited utility of units that make few predictions about measurable traits in most of the genome. The very fact that reproductive communities of the past are so directly testable by both morphology and genes across the genome that they leave such an imprint is precisely why they're so much more useful for organizing our knowledge of biodiversity than BSC units. Taxonomic species inferred by their morphological traces have been relevant all along. Now, I speak as somebody that's been through the times when that wasn't recognized. I think it's getting more recognized already. Nuestro concepto retrospectivo de comunidades reproductivas es diferente de los otros, pero no es tan nuevo porque efectivamente es el concepto de los tubos de los modelos coalescentes. También es consistente en principio con la práctica de los taxónomos morfológicos. Aunque los métodos morfológicos no pueden descubrir fácilmente el aislamiento actual, sí pueden descubrir el aislamiento del pasado. Ok, preguntas. No estoy pidiendo preguntas. Voy a preguntar las preguntas. If species are reproductive communities of the past, how are they different from populations? I haven't said that yet, right? I haven't actually told you, like, they're reproductive. Well, what's the difference? There is no universal and natural rank of species. Sorry. And so this actually is, so you can insist on a natural rank of species if you go for something like the BSC, as long as you're willing to have a species concept that isn't very useful. You either get predictivity or you get a defined species rank. I think it's a little more important to have something that actually has causal statements about the world that are broader. The distinction must be determined in most, like we talk about this a lot in the paper, partly because Jeanette really was hoping that there'd be one. I was a bit more of a skeptic from the beginning, and we sort of went halfway, but fundamentally, in most cases, it would be very hard to argue for a natural species rank. But if the species rank is arbitrary, how do we count species for phylogenetic studies of diversification? Uh-oh. So my bet is that inference of deep, and we have something on this in the paper, but we don't go into it too deeply. Inference of deep time processes is probably okay. But shallow processes need to be, how we deal with them need to be adjusted, and they can probably be done by adding qualities of taxa, and so you can see section 6.2. What do I think will be the most uncomfortable aspects of our concept? I think that the extrinsic isolation being enough to delimit species is sort of a freaky thing. You know, like you got an isolated population. But that interacts with rank, because you got an isolated population in Russia and another one in Argentina. You say, well, we can call them isolated reproductive communities, but since rank isn't if they basically look identical, and if rank is somewhat arbitrary, then we can still call them the same species as long as they're monophyletic together, right? So it's not actually a big problem. But the lack of a natural rank is something that's going to freak us out. The fact that phylogeneticists mostly have not been prepared, I think, to think about processes is integral, but it actually isn't going to affect what they do very much. So I don't think it's going to be too uncomfortable. So de Quiros 2007 has 4,000 citations, but I haven't mentioned it, or at least I barely mentioned it. Why not? His concept is important, but it doesn't answer the question of what a species is at the moment. It's a broad metaphysical statement that he makes. So, which I think it's important, but it doesn't actually answer the question at stake. So does this analysis depend upon the current system of taxonomy, which treats species as simple and discrete, little boxes into which we put things? No, and to learn about that, you should read about taxonomatic. What is taxonomatic? It's a dystopian vision, so you'll have to read that. How do we think speciation biologists will respond to our analysis? Now, if there are speciation biologists in the audience, I might have triggered you to some extent, depending upon how you responded to my comments on the BSc. Jeanette considers herself a speciation biologist, so we've thought a lot about this. We don't know, but we see our approach is consistent completely with the approach of speciation biology, except perhaps the use of some words. Because speciation biology already considers all factors, geography, physiology, et cetera, and it sees species, it studies species both retrospectively and contemporaneously. So it actually already does all of the causal thinking that we're talking about. And so we say, if there's any discipline that has little need to be constrained by a fixed species concept, it's speciation biology. The one word that we need to think about, especially besides species, is the word speciation, right? So it would best be defined not as the achievement of reproductive isolation, but more broadly as a process of achieving independence and distinction. Speciation is incurring whether or not any lineage ever achieves complete reproductive isolation. The word speciation is therefore like the word knitting, about a process of making without presupposing the form or completion of the product. So this concept that we're presenting, it concerns only grouping, not ranking. We haven't really pulled ranking into it. And also the RRCC is really vague about this cohesive. We haven't said, well, it's 20% of this and 30% of that or whatever. Does that mean the concept is incomplete? Correct. And it must remain incomplete. Because rank belongs to humans, and because there will be no universal blend of processes that shape reproductive communities. The processes vary clade by clade. In some clades, lineages are going to be distinguished and made distinct more by reproductive interactions, and others more by ecology. And one consequence that I won't get into is that asexual lineages have as much a right to be called species as do sexual lineages. So you can take that either way, get rid of species and everything, or treat the asexual lineages with the same respect. Nuestro concepto es incompleto, necesariamente. Podemos dictar dos requisitos necesarios. Las especies buenas tienen que incluir procesos cohesivos, tienen que ser retrospectivos, pero biólogos no pueden dictar mucho más universalmente. La naturaleza tiene que completar el cuadro, especie por especie, porque cada uno puede formarse de un conjunto diferente de procesos. Okay, now the dialogue. So this is where I start. This is actually now, I've sort of said this concept, but this is sort of introspective thoughts that I've had about this since, because I had to undergo a transformation to come to this point. So a species concept cannot characterize what a species is completely and universally, not if it is to be broadly useful. So biologists can philosophize, and they can construct abstract boxes to put nature into. But the abstract box must be partial. It must be open. It cannot entrap nature. Our concept is intentionally incomplete, having only two walls. Now, if you think, well, what's a complete one? The monophyly ones are complete. They say, there it is, that's it. Especially like the genealogical ones are extremely contained. It says that to be useful to biologists, a species must be retrospective and been bound by cohesive process. But nature will complete the picture. It will choose clade by clade what is the full nature of each species. And what I've realized as I've done this is that the question, what is a species, tends to be approached in two different ways. Some biologists design an abstract concept to dictate what should be called a species in biological research. Some biologists see species as enigmatic objects in nature that we stumble upon and try to understand. What is this thing? In the first, the concept is invented. It's precise. It is a logical and philosophical problem. Conceiving is an act of speaking, of telling. In the second, the concept is discovered, uncertain. It is an empirical problem. Conceiving is an act of listening. Our concept balances the two. It has two requisites, retrospection and process, and it leaves the rest to nature. It might seem that I'm saying something really obvious here, that scientists both propose and test, right? But I'm saying something different. And this is more not so much about metaphysics or about the formal structure of science, but it's about emphasis and orientation. And so now I'm going to completely go away from the science per se to talk about this shift in me that I had to have to do this. And so this has definitely got points that are not scientific. I just warn you. So this conclusion is not what I had expected when I began the project with Jeanette. The Wayne, and remember the two biologists? The Wayne that began working on this project was Wayne number 2. Abstract, conceptual, living inside my head, in control of the ideas, in control of the logic. I expected to propose abstract concept of species based upon general ideas in biology or philosophy, and I expected it to be complete. I wanted to construct precise little boxes of logic into which to put nature. I took the approach of invention, of speaking. I was not really trying to listen to nature, and perhaps even I was trying to mansplain nature. I've thought about this a lot, and I think that that's probably true. I did not succeed. Actually, by the way, just in case I had given this in Spanish, I had to look up how you say mansplain in Spanish. And I got to say, macho explicar, no, it's not too bad, but the compactness of mansplain is really nice. So anyway, but I did not succeed. I was not able to find a satisfying complete box. And it was really frustrating, right? I was completely confused between the past, the present, and the future, and all sorts, I was just tying myself in knots. To Jeanette, on the other hand, species existed in nature before we arrived to look at them. She took the approach of discovery. She sought to listen to nature. At the start of the project, I really resisted Jeanette's point of view. And likewise, I disliked some species concepts for their vagueness about process. So Templeton's cohesion and the evolutionary species concept of Simpson et al. And I thought they were failing to take control of the ideas. Eventually, at last, I accepted Jeanette's perspective. Species belong to nature. They are not electrons. They are not all alike. We must let them have their own ways to exist. After 6 years of work, we finally found this right balance between theory and nature. The key was to develop the abstract concepts as far as we could, but then to accept their limits, the point at which to let go, and to cede control to nature. So as I emphasize this letting go, I'm not promoting mysticism. I'm promoting an attitude, right, of humility with respect to our knowledge, to never believe that our ideas are complete or in control, a belief that we must, more than we usually do, stop speaking, sit down, and listen to nature. Science is a half-silvered mirror. Through it, we see nature, but we also see ourselves. And our gaze must be centered on nature, not on our own reflections. We have to propose ideas, but we must remember that they answer to nature, not the other way around. Learning to respect, and this is not just about science, but it does have to do with these ideas about nature. Learning to respect another's agency, learning to listen, are not just moral imperatives, they're the path to discovery and truth. So this is not from the paper, but I've written a blog post that will get posted when our article comes out. And in it, I wrote, and this is after thinking a lot about what I had been through by finding a way to let go. The scientific process must be lit by the harsh glare of evidence and logic, but it must be accompanied by grace, an offering of open attention towards nature. The reductionist program would have us believe that all understanding comes from shattering into pieces and parameters. I meant accepted ideas as they mature should resolve towards crisp logical abstractions. But we cannot forget that they are our brass rubbings, not nature's original art. As nature is being explored, as possibilities are being conceived and tested, science must dare to look outward to the untamed, to look beyond our inner dialogue, to listen rather than to speak. This is natural history. And when I say natural history, I'm including taxonomy as well, by the way. By taking a stance of listening to nature with patience and deference, one is put into a different mode of attention, open to surprises. What is heard while listening guides, or at least should guide, what path is chosen. Even after science finds and follows a path of shattering and quantification, our ears and eyes should remain always open, lest we succumb to the hubris of artificial certainty. So when our project began, I wore the hat of Wayne number 2, the speaker. Wayne number 2 forgot to listen to the listener. Wayne number 1, the taxonomist, his work is to listen to nature. And I think the taxonomist Wayne would have understood Jeanette's point of view much more quickly. But Wayne number 2 has a big mouth. A los que hablan, quienes hacen y prueben gran teorías, que siguen con sus teorías, pero también practiquen sus oídos para escuchar los calladitos, los historiadores naturales, que son expertos en escuchar a la naturaleza. A los que escuchan, quienes abren sus ojos a la naturaleza, que siguen con su trabajo importante, pero también reserven un poco de tiempo para practicar sus voces. Aprenden la idioma teórica para comunicar las observaciones suyas a los teóricos que son expertos en comunicar. Si tú crees que haces los dos muy bien, hablar y escuchar, felicitaciones y gracias. Antes de yo pensaría que yo sabía cómo escuchar muy bien, pero ya aprendí. Más preguntas. Esto es casi acabado. ¿Dónde se encuentra el artículo? No salió todavía. Entonces este QR code te lleva al periódico nomás, pero este es el título. He hablado antes sobre la importancia de apoyar un equilibrio entre teoría y historia natural en la ciencia. Sí. Tengo un artículo subversivo en 1996. Este es el QR code. Ok. Va a estar en... entonces, voy a pedir que nos salga el video de este antes que está publicado el artículo. Porque queremos que la primera cosa que gente ven es el cuento total, ¿no? Pero cuando salga, los QR codes van a estar ya también. Tengo este webinar subversivo, tal vez más subversivo este. Uf, yo tengo una actitud en este. Y ahí está este. Ok. Y di una otra plática subversiva, pero descubrí hoy mañana que ya quitaron del internet, pero yo tengo una grabación, entonces voy a poner otra vez. En el año 2023, con tantas maravillas digitales, ¿por qué dibujo? La respuesta está en mi video sobre dibujando arañas. Ahí está este. Pero tengo que dejar que las arañas tienen la última palabra. Siempre los organismos tienen que tener la última palabra, ¿no? Entonces, este es una araña que todavía, este es lo que yo enseñé al comienzo, que todavía no está descrito. No está descrito, entonces no tiene voz. Los los taxónomos sienten que mucho de nuestro trabajo es una obra sagrada, ¿no? Porque estamos dando una voz a las especies, a los organismos. Cada vez que hay algo que no está descrito, no sabemos, no puedes seguir, participar en la conversación de conservación y de muchas otras cosas en biología. Entonces, nuestro trabajo es dar una voz a las especies. Entonces, este no tiene voz. Primera vez que vi fue en el sur de Alberta, en Canadá, en 1977, pero esta es su distribución conocida ahorita. Los números, los fechas azules son los sitios donde yo encontré esta especie. Y resulta que sí vive aquí, cerca de Ajusco, allá. Y ojalá que encontramos unos en los próximos días. Pero es bien bonito. Y escuché que Susana quiso que hay unos videos de arañas. Entonces tengo que poner un poquito de videos de arañas. No me acuerdo si enseñé estos a ustedes en una otra visita, pero este es uno bien bonito, bien chiquito, con ojos enormes de Brasil. Y este es el macho, la hembra está aquí, él está mirando, mirando. Oh, mira, ¿qué hay en el mundo? ¿Qué hay? Oh, oh, una hembra. Oh, este es mi chance. Ok. Oh, ok, aquí vengo. Ok. Ya. Listo, listo, listo. Ok, voy a empezar mi baile. Ok, aquí me voy. ¡Ah! Oh, se fue. Pero, oh, espera, no se fue lejos. Tal vez tengo otra chance. Ok. Listo. Dice, ok, aquí voy. Ya. Y se fue. Este es un video bueno para indicar cómo usan estos arañas su visión, ¿no? Es tan obvio que están orientando al mundo con su visión. Y este es un otro de Brasil también. Y hay parientes bien cercanos en México, pero no tienen estos. Estos son sus hileras que hacen seda, que es bien alargados, ¿no? Aquí, en este macho. Y lo que él hace este es su carita con su sombrerito. Um, Se llama Meiota. Y aquí está, y él va a parar bien alto y va a empujar sus dos hileras por al lado. ¡Pum! Y la cosa interesante de ella está mirando él desde abajo. Está mirando el bajo y está mirando estos hileras y todo. Mira, ¿ves cómo se? Oh, este es tan bonito. Ahí está. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias, Wayne. Tenemos tiempo para si alguien tiene una pregunta.
No sé si hablar en español o en inglés.
Intenta en español, ¿no? Primero.
Ok, bueno, habla de el concepto de Kairos y creo que es cierto que es una declaración ontológica, an ontological claim.
Sí.
And then
O
algunos
tal vez vas a estar hablando de estos asuntos mejor en inglés.
uh, me hold in claim that there could be uh,
Spanglish está bien.
three criteria of the species concept that could be the best. And indeed, the Kairos concept perhaps could be arguably universal. It could be theoretically significant, but it is not practical. It is not operational. And he claims that it is not bad, that is an ontological claim, and rather that ontological and operational concepts operan a un nivel conceptual distinto,
Sí.
que uno intentan definir lo que son la especie y otros delimitar lo que son las especies en la práctica.
Ya. Sí, no, sí tenemos, sí, yo creo que voy a enfocar en un dicho que él tiene que yo creo que está equivocado, que dice que muchos de los conceptos que son nombrados no son distintos a nivel ontológico, solo en el nivel práctico de cómo resolvemos. Y decimos no, que no es solamente que cada uno es estamos intentando lograr descubrir una cosa por muchas maneras y que el hecho que saquen respuestas diferentes solo son errores. No, están preguntando cosas diferentes. Están preguntando cosas diferentes del mundo, ¿no? Y es bien difícil pensar en todo esto. Tenemos parte de nuestro artículo de que habla de qué difícil es distinguir las cosas de identidad, fronteras y identidad por tiempo. Y no puedo explicar todo ahorita, seguramente no en español, pero no estamos en acuerdo que es solo una cosa, una estrella ontológica que todo pertenece a estos métodos. No, son cosas diferentes que estamos. Y lo peor es que no es una cosa de operationalism, es un asunto de la pregunta que los biólogos tuvieron todo el rato, no es la pregunta que él contestó. Es que, ¿qué tenemos adelante de nosotros? ¿Qué es nuestro concepto? Es un concepto de las identidades, las fronteras adelante de nosotros, ¿no? Ya, este es todo lo que puedo decir ahorita de este.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm just gonna use English.
Okay.
So I'm glad you went kind of full circle, right? On your talk and on your reflection about species. And it reminded me of a paper by Ronald Brady in 1985. It's a beautiful paper called On the Independence of Systematics. And Brady proposed that systematics should stay as an independent discipline and that should look for patterns instead of trying to mix patterns and processes, because then it would lose the scientific value by including the explanand in the explanandum. And if we are trying to understand what species are, and we find it really challenging, we have been talking about the ontology of a species for almost more than 200 years, and we haven't gotten much farther. We're still disagreeing on the ontology of the species, but we are still naming a species, right? So the operation is good enough. Don't you think that, I mean, you criticize the Kairos concept, saying that it was metaphysical. But since we know so little about the processes that create a species or are involved in molecular biology, molecular evolution, don't you think your concept is also, it includes also metaphysical claims, right? Wouldn't it be better to learn about species first, identifying these units or being able to, tell them apart, and then sort of like what Pat and Cladis are trying to do with phylogenetics?
Yeah. So I'm going to stick to my conclusion that operationalism is powerless. And so the problem with Brady's paper and that perspective is that if it is to make any claims that we want to continue with, it either has to be fossilized in place with a certain set of knowledge that can never be increased, or it has to make weak claims forever. And so we talk about this in respect to with respect to these operational species concepts, and we say it like this, that if you propose a species concept, whether it's just whatever morphological taxonomists do or something about multivariate statistics or whatever, and you define a species concept, and you say, I want to go here because I don't want to assume process. Then, yeah, and these people that do this say, well, like Mallet will say, for instance, that, well, oh dear, this shouldn't come out. Sorry, Jim. Would presumably say like that the processes are assumed, they're there, we understand enough about them to say that these units that came out of our cluster analysis will be useful. But if we gain any extra knowledge about how evolution works, we're faced with either adjusting our cluster method, because there's no guarantee that it will actually reflect a new understanding, or we stay where we are forever. And science can stay where it is forever. Everything that we do is this stepping stones of gaining more information about process, leading us then to take a step forward. We cannot afford to take any branch of science and say, we will refuse to learn, because that's what Brady's paper is saying. The independence of systematics is to say, we will refuse to learn how to do this better. We will refuse to learn how the universe is built, right? And I don't think science can afford to do that.
Thank you. Well, okay, so different processes produce speciation, no? So could you say a word about the cohesive species concept or the recognition species concept?
You know, I don't. So the one thing I'll say is that this, and this relates to the last part of my talk, that I didn't have much respect for the cohesive species concept process, the concept when I started this process, and I gained a lot of respect for it by the end. Cohesion versus recognition, I haven't thought about those details. The one thing about, so Templeton's presentation is, his cohesion is very clearly BSC-like in that it's contemporaneous and it's intrinsic. It's intrinsic only, but at least it's comprehensive. And I think that's a good thing. But I don't have anything intelligent to say about that distinction.
¿Qué tal, Wayne? Voy a intentar en español.
Okay.
Mira, me gustó muchísimo la perspectiva pluralista. Uso el término pluralista como se usa en filosofía de la biología. Tú estás muy familiarizado con eso. Que además me parece que es un pluralismo de segundo orden. Solo que el orden superior en el cual tú te estás moviendo no es el clásico del pluralismo de que hay un concepto de especies para plantas, uno para hongos, uno para animales, sino que tiene que ver con justamente el tipo de procesos que tenemos que poner en juego para la construcción del concepto de especies que queremos, ¿no? Y tu visión de la incompletud intrínseca de los conceptos de especies, pues estoy completamente de acuerdo contigo. También en el momento histórico del desarrollo de la ciencia en el que estamos, pues tenemos la crisis climática encima y bueno, somos más humildes y creo que eso, creo que hay un carácter antropocénico de tu perspectiva filosófica, ¿no? Creo que yo así lo leo.
Sí.
Ahora, habiendo dicho lo anterior, eso es lo que me gusta y creo que es muy productivo intelectualmente, regresando a los asuntos más de la teoría ya publicada y lo que le enseñamos a los estudiantes y demás, ¿tú te acuerdas, por ejemplo, cuando Olivier Rippel ha hecho este intento, por ejemplo, de meter una perspectiva ontogeneticista, ¿no? Acudiendo al concepto de homeostatic property cluster kind de Richard Boyd, ¿te acuerdas? Sí. ¿No? Entonces, creo que la dimensión ontogenética, sobre todo por tu reconocimiento de que la naturaleza es quien nos debe de decir a fin de cuentas qué son las especies, es un ángulo o una pared que no está siendo todavía atendida, en mi opinión, por muchos de los autores que siguen escribiendo sobre species concepts, problems, etc. Entonces, quería saber tu opinión sobre si tú crees que es necesario o tú incluso ves hacia el futuro cercano en tu propio desarrollo con tu colega Witton, la incorporación de consideraciones que tengan que ver con la ontogenia, ¿no? No necesariamente basadas en el evodevo molecular, sino también en otras cosas que le ocurren pues, a los organismos que no solo crecen y se desarrollan, sino que aprenden. O sea, tus casos de las arañas son maravillosos porque aquí la conducta es lo que nos llama más la atención, ¿no? No tanto la morfología, sino lo que hacen.
Sí.
O sea, es fascinante, ¿no? El caso de las arañas saltarinas.
Sí.
Entonces, bueno, por ahí va mi pregunta central. Gracias.
Ok. Uf. Tengo que, hay varias cosas. Uno es que yo considero que nuestro punto de vista es bien consistente con lo de Boyd. Sobre si el pluralismo clarista, en el sentido que cada clado puede tener su propia manera de ser especies, sí. Esta es parte de, porque mira, tener especies en el sentido del biological species concept es una sinapomorfía de eucariota, ¿no? Otros clados tienen su propio sinapomorfía de una manera de ser una especie, ¿no? Pero el asunto de las cosas ontogenéticas, yo no indiqué más o menos ecología, cosas reproductivas, pero sí, de verdad, muchas cosas de integración del genoma y cómo las cosas crezcan y todo, sí, va a ser parte de todo también, seguro que forma los lineajes de qué puede ser una identidad y cómo puede conectar con la naturaleza y cómo está. Pero nada, gracias. No voy a decir nada más.
Ok, muchas gracias a todos. Si tienen más preguntas, pueden acercar a Juan después. Vamos a cerrar el seminario ahorita, pero agradecemos mucho su
Gracias.
ponencia.